The Wire is one of those shows that will always be relevant because of the unforgiving way that it comments on the world around us. The show is often called a docudrama because of how realistic it is. Not only does it work to get all the technicalities of the justice, education, and labor systems correct, but it simultaneously creates these complex characters with a web of intricate relationships and makes us care about them too. We're not there yet, but it's hard for me to look at Royo without crying because I love Bubbles so much. And if you've seen the show, you know what I'm talking about. The Wire marked a bridging of popular and urban Baltimorean culture, whether because the show brought urban culture to light or in some cases because it glossed over that culture. For example, West Baltimore was a thriving community prior to the crack epidemic and has a rich Black cultural history in terms of political and celebrity visits and riots after the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. But that is never mentioned in The Wire. What the show did bring to life extremely well was the corruption that laced the city's political landscape, addiction that helped tear apart communities, and the futility that is individuals trying to tackle systemic issues. People outside of Baltimore assumed that the show encompassed the entire city. This would cause a problem for The Wire production, and nearly caused the show to be filmed in Pennsylvania rather than on location in Baltimore. It has taken me forever to talk about The Wire just because of the sheer amount of discourse there is. The show is so dense. There are a million different ways you can talk about it. In an effort not to eat anyone else's lunch or to retread the same information, this video will be more about the behind the scenes and an analysis of real life implications of the show with some retrospective elements here and there. If you haven't watched the show, this isn't the series for you. There will be spoilers, but I'm not going to recap everything or mention every character or plot line. Here are some really great channels that theorize about the show and incorporate some real world stories as well that I think are great and that I probably referenced for this series. When we left off after we finished talking about The Corner, David Simon and his friends Ed Burns and writer David Mills had just finished working on The Corner, an HBO miniseries directed by Charles S. Dutton and starring T.K. Carter, Candy Alexander, and Sean Nelson. Immediately, Simon began working on the next show that he would pitch to HBO. Let's talk about The Wire. Simon decided to pitch his idea for The Wire to HBO around 2000, right after The Corner. Not only did he already have a relationship with the network because of The Corner, but the premise of The Wire itself was something that Simon didn't think would perform well on regular network television. Prior to streaming services, networks like HBO, Showtime, and Starz created more experimental and raunchy shows since their audience was made up entirely of subscribers, people that paid monthly to watch their lineup, and not casual television viewers. They had a bit of cushion in case shows didn't pan out. It's also my understanding that premium channels have looser regulations in terms of obscene and profane content, but I'm not an expert and I'm not sure, so please don't quote me on that. Simon said that he and his writing team were bored with good and evil, primarily because he had discovered through all of his previous work that good and evil are just misunderstandings of the same concept. So he and his team decided to do away with the notion entirely, focusing more on the characters' pride, relationships, and selfish desires than their morality. The show also wouldn't place importance on happy endings or even reassure its audience that things would eventually get better, because real life often does not get better. Simon would say, "It is perhaps the only storytelling on television that overtly suggests that our political and economic and social constructs are no longer viable, that our leadership has failed us relentlessly, and that no, we are not going to be alright." Just like The Corner and Homicide Life on the Street, Simon wanted The Wire to debunk myths about large institutions using what he and Ed Burns knew about the Baltimore Police Department, the school system, and media and journalism. Simon would say the main goal of these institutions is to perpetuate and protect themselves. The main goal of the institutional players is to preserve or expand their power. Simon wanted to talk about the lack of altruism in institutions as a whole, not just the police department or the justice system. He wanted his audience to know that capitalist systems are full of corruption. In the audio commentary for the pilot episode, Simon would say that the show is really about the American city and about how we live together. It's about how institutions have an effect on individuals, whether one is a cop, a longshoreman, a drug dealer, a politician, a judge, or a lawyer. All are ultimately compromised and must contend with whatever institution to which they are committed. This idea of the show being about the American city is one that he would stand by, saying that though the link between The Wire and Baltimore is set in stone, he could have made this show by focusing on any large metropolitan city. After the show was eventually greenlit, Simon would say, "The first thing we had to do was teach folks to watch television in a different way, to slow themselves down and pay attention." The Wire was sometimes called a show that wanted to be a book. due to the intricacy of the dialogue and the sheer number of characters the show brought to screen. In fact, there were so many characters that some actors went the entire show without having scenes with other characters. For example, Delaney Williams, who plays Sergeant J. Landsman, has a scene with Andre Royo, who plays Bubbles, for the very first time at the end of the 4th season, despite the fact that they were both in the show since the beginning. Simon chose to focus on open-air drug markets in order to put a spotlight on the aspects of Baltimore that the tourist crowd never gets to see, saying, "At best, our metropolises are the ultimate aspiration of community, the repository for every myth and hope of people clinging to the sides of the pyramid that is capitalism. At worst, our cities, or those places in our cities where most of us fear to tread, are vessels for the darkest contradictions and most brutal competitions that underlie the way we actually live together, or fail to live together." Capitalism has been getting obliterated in the critical landscape lately, about time. So here's a definition for us to work with and keep in mind throughout the video. Capitalism is an economic system of governance where private actors are allowed to own and control the use of property in accord with their own interests, and where the invisible hand of the pricing mechanism coordinates supply and demand. The government, in this perspective, is often described as responsible for peace, justice, and tolerable taxes. We know that side effects of capitalism are low wages for the proletariat or working class, high earnings for upper-level management, large profits for businesses, irreparable environmental damage, lobbying in order to sway political efforts, price gouging, etc. With The Wire, Simon was looking to expose how large cities are often home to the most privileged and to the most impoverished, who experience capitalism in opposing ways. Specifically, Simon said that the show is about the triumph of capitalism over human value. With this new show came a new way to interpret the police procedural. Remember when we talked about homicide and how they would work on multiple cases every episode and some cases would never get solved? That was entirely new for television at the time, and Simon wanted to implement even more changes to the police procedural format with this show. First, there was the idea that police procedurals are propaganda at their core and advocate for policy changes in favor of police. The standard police procedural focuses on good, if sometimes imperfect, cops trying to find the real bad guys, the perpetrators, and bring them to justice. A crime had ruptured the social fabric, and at the end of the episode, guilt is determined and things are put to right. The standard procedural is concerned mainly with individual fault and individual heroism. Other shows tell us that cops need free rein, that we ought to trust their instincts and keep the government and the Constitution off their backs. This show vividly demonstrates that those instincts are sometimes misguided or self-protective, and that the right kinds of limits can play an important role in good police work. Not only was Simon seeking to discuss the truth of budgeting and policy when it comes to policing like he did with homicide, he also wanted to humanize those that are policed by bringing light to the organizations and issues of both the working class and those that exist in the drug game, like he did with The Corner, through creating more complex portrayals of those characters, most of them black, though much of The Wire's writing and production staff was white. Prior to The Wire, not many shows had complex portrayals of black characters. Black people were portrayed as either thugs with no backstory and therefore undeserving of our sympathy, or well-to-do and therefore more judgmental of their poor counterparts. For more information on this, check out my videos on Loquisha and In Living Color. The Wire made thug characters likable by focusing on their humanity, families, and intelligence. Rhonda Rasha Penrice writes, "If given access, the characters had the talent, the charisma, and the drive to have been successful. Instead, they sought to get over before they went under." Simon showed how hard and risky drug crime is, and that for some people, it's the only way out of a bad situation. Not only this, but he made it clear that even the city's legitimate institutions depended on drug crime and the interplay of illegal and legitimate activities to keep them from going under. Not only did Simon want to create portrayals of more complex black characters, but by getting to know these characters, we learn what community means to them and the steps they take to save their community. After watching Wallace, Bodie, and Poot work so hard to create family with one another, and seeing how Wallace takes care of a row house full of children, it hurts much more to learn that in order to retain their place in the family, Bodie and Poot have to kill Wallace, a character who loved them dearly and who was still so innocent that he played with toys. We will absolutely come back to this because it's the type of ambiguity that the show is full of. HBO was hesitant to greenlight the pilot for The Wire because they thought the show seemed like a standard police procedural, which HBO felt was beneath their network. In fact, many people feel like the very first season of the show is pretty standard, at least when compared to the other seasons. I am one of those people. In order to get the pilot greenlit, Simon and his writing staff had to write 2 additional scripts, wait around for a year, and send what David Simon called a begging ass memo to Chris Albrecht, an executive over at HBO. When the rest of the pilot was greenlit, Simon and Burns had written the next 6 episodes since they knew the show was intricate and they wanted to make sure that they got the details correct. Finally, Ed Burns would say something that would cohesively and succinctly summarize the show's perspective in terms of the interconnectedness of institutions and society's opinions about addiction. The addiction rate is increasing, not only in the inner city, but all over the country, because the jobs are disappearing. And if I don't need you to work anymore, I'll just get rid of you. I can't kill you, that would be bad, so I send you down the road of addiction, which is hideous. And I'm quite content to say it's your fault, because you got addicted, not society's fault. And that's the interesting thing. Why don't we do something about drugs? If drugs went away, law enforcement, as it's structured today, would take a terrible hit. Casting for The Wire required a variety of tactics. First, Simon wanted actors from the East Coast so that they didn't have to pay for hotels while filming in Baltimore. He also wanted mostly undiscovered actors to give the show more of a documentary feel, and so that it wouldn't seem like any one person was starring in it. He wanted the audience to get to know the characters and not the actors playing the characters. One casting director named Pat Moran would stand on the streets of Baltimore and hand out her card asking people if they were interested in being extras for the show. Not only was this a good way to access a lot of people at once, it also ensured that they got authentic talent and explains why so many on the show were native to Baltimore. Talent detectives, Moran said. When it comes down to the corner, nobody can fill that space but people from the corner. These kids know what goes on down there, and it makes the show better. She would also say, we're not there to exploit them, but to tell their story. What we portrayed was not racially ambiguous kids who could have played a sitcom. We cast Baltimore. Since Pat Moran and Vincent Peranio, a producer for the show, were both Baltimore natives, they knew where to look for the appropriate talent. Peranio would go on to say, I think every Baltimorean is born with 2 things built into their personality: nostalgia and apathy. Pat Moran would bring S. Robert Morgan, who played Omar's wise advisor Butchie, into the show. Butchie was sort of an all-seeing blind man, like an oracle found in Greek tragedies. Simon called him the physical manifestation of an ancient seer. Butchie's casting really fit with the Greek tragedy theme, but in terms of The Wire, the all-knowing, all-seeing, and vengeful gods are actually institutions. They also got a lot of actors from the Baltimore School for the Arts. Anton Artis, who played Stinkum, and Corey Parker Robinson, who played R.C. in The Corner and Sidner in The Wire, were students there, while Maria Broom, who played Bunchy in The Corner and Marla in The Wire, taught there. Robert Chu, who played Prop Joe, who would advise a lot of the younger actors on the show, especially in season 4, went there in the 70s. Corey Parker Robinson's being casted from BSA was poetic because Detective Sidner would often go undercover as an addict because of how well he blended in on the streets. There was also Lawrence Gilliard Jr., who played Dangelo Barksdale, who grew up in West Baltimore, right near the Barksdale turf. The New York leg of the casting was done by Alexa Fogel, who liked breaking new actors, especially theater actors that had yet to secure screen roles. All actors on the show were given a chance to meet real BPD officers and to do ride-alongs of some sort. Similarly, actors that were playing addicts or touts were given opportunities to meet the real people that assumed those roles. However, Simon didn't want actors to meet the people their characters were based on, so that they didn't pick up on something that wasn't supposed to show up in the show. Here's some more background on specific characters and how their actors were cast. Characters were often a combination of more than one person's characteristics. For example, Avon Barksdale, one of our big figureheads throughout the series, was a pastiche of at least 3 different people. First, he was based on Nathan Bodie Barksdale, a prominent figure in the Baltimore drug game at one point in time. Not only did they use his last name, but they used his nickname for J.D. Williams' character, Bodie. Rather than giving you a rundown about Barksdale, I'll point you to the documentary he self-released so that you can learn about him from him. He's interviewed by Wood Harris in the documentary, and it's an interesting watch. Avon Barksdale was also based on a man named Warren Bordley. Bordley was a young boxer and sentenced to 43 years in prison. Just like Avon, Bordley wanted to keep the high-rises as a part of his territory and kept dropping bodies to do so, which attracted police attention. He was arrested in 1988 for murder, not for drug trafficking. The idea that homicide attracts troubling police attention for drug organizations more than the drugs themselves is another idea that shows up in The Wire. Finally, and probably most prominently, Barksdale was based on Melvin Williams. In fact, back in 1987, Simon wrote a series for the Baltimore Sun called Easy Money: Anatomy of a Drug Empire. The series profiled the wiretap investigation of Williams, who would also appear in the show beginning in season 3. The series outlined a profile of Williams that would bring him to life for anyone reading. While the primary focus was Little Melvin's crimes and the subsequent investigation, Simon also made sure to mention that Little Melvin was involved in community initiatives and meetings, that he was a family-oriented man, and that for the most part he stayed off of the streets and out of trouble, humanizing the man so many had developed disdain for. The nuances of Little Melvin were essentially copied and pasted for Barksdale's character, which is why Avon is so careful, patient, and community and family oriented. Williams was also very smart, very patient, and very careful. Like Barksdale, he wasn't out and about having photos taken of him. Of course, I'll link to an archived version of the story if you want to read it. When talking about Williams and his role on the show, Simon said that Williams was an imperious, intelligent man who chooses his words with care. Melvin Williams refuses to be stereotyped. Street sales of narcotics were routinely punctuated by murderous violence. But Williams was a family man, devoted to an 11-year marriage and 2 young daughters. The first actor cast for this show was Wendell Pierce, who played William Bunk Moreland. Bunk was based on former homicide detective Oscar Rick Riker, who would often call other associates Bunk and then earn the nickname himself. Allegedly, Pierce came into his audition pissed because he was trying to get a taxi while black and had a hard time. His anger is what helped him secure the part. If you've seen The Wire, you know Bunk is usually pissed about something. Also, he's like always cheating on his wife. Funnily enough, Pierce thought Rick Riker didn't like him because Riker had come to set one day, squinted his eyes at Pierce for a long time, and then left. But later, Riker would tell him that he just couldn't see. After retiring from homicide in 1998, Riker began working in the retirement office, making sure that widows got the pensions for deceased officers. Sergeant J. Landsman was portrayed by Delaney Williams, who had previously had a small role in The Corner. Though Williams was great in the role as Landsman and absolutely the best choice, casting him was an inside joke. The real J. Landsman auditioned for the character based on himself and had some acting experience in cameo roles in Homicide: Life on the Street, but didn't get the part. Landsman was a tall and rather thin man, so casting Williams in the role was a way for Simon to sort of fuck with him, especially since during his time on the BPD, Detective Landsman was known for playing practical jokes. Simon still gave Landsman a part on the show. He played a character named Dennis Mello, and I'm not sure if this was a joke or not, but the real Dennis Mello is black and was the first black man to become captain at the BPD and was portrayed by white Detective Landsman. At first, Simon and producers wanted Ray Winstone for the part of Jimmy McNulty, but since casting was taking place just after 9/11, all of the planes were grounded and Winstone, an English actor, was no longer interested in pursuing the role. They also considered John C. Reilly for the role, but his wife refused to move to Baltimore for the duration of filming, so he was out. An English actor named Dominic West ended up getting the part. Since he couldn't come in for the actual audition, he had to record and send over his audition tape. He was auditioning with a scene between McNulty and Bunk, and his wife read Bunk's lines to help out. But all that did was make him laugh. Eventually, he sent her out and just reacted to silence where Bunk's lines should have been. If you'll notice, there's a bit of a difference between West and the other 2 actors they were considering for the role. He's quite a bit younger and more conventionally attractive, which just isn't what HBO wanted for McNulty, a deeply flawed character, a compulsive womanizer, an alcoholic, an officer of the law who has difficulty staying within the confines of legality. They wanted someone older and more experienced, but that's not what they got. So the Wire producers had to work to convince HBO to greenlight West in the role. Alexa Fogel tried to cast Idris Elba in a separate project, but he didn't end up getting that role. And Fogel really liked Elba because she thought his American accent was impeccable, and she did everything she could to set him up for The Wire. At the time, Elba was living in the US and he was down on hard times. He was running out of money, his lease was about to end, and his daughter was about to be born. If he didn't get the part in The Wire, he'd have to go back to England. Funnily enough, the day that his daughter was born was the day that he got the part of Richard Stringer Bell. Stringer is based in part on a man named Lamont Chin Farmer, who was Little Melvin's right-hand man. According to writer Jonathan Abrams, Farmer orchestrated both a simple and intricate communication system involving the use of beepers. He also headed a print shop and took business courses at a community college, a la Idris Elba's Stringer Bell. Michael B. Jordan, who played Wallace in the first season of the show, originally auditioned for the role of Bodie. Could you imagine that? Alexa Fogel and Clark Johnson, who starred in Homicide, would have a large role in season 5 of The Wire and directed the pilot episode of The Wire, asked Jordan to read for Wallace. Jordan was one of the youngest in the original cast. He was 14 when he got the role, and other cast members took him under their wing to help him prepare. This included Royo, helping him prepare for Wallace's eventual drug use toward the end of the first season, and other non-disclosed cast members taking him to a strip club for character research. Shakima Greggs is the main good black female character on The Wire, and she's portrayed by Sonia Sohn. If you look back at the show, you can count the number of black female characters on like 7 fingers, and most of them are not characters that we're necessarily supposed to root for. Greggs was a combination of stories Simon had heard from male detectives and a female detective named Bertina Silver. Do you remember when we talked about Detective Kate Howard in our discussion about homicide life on the street in my The Corner video? According to production, they had to make up the rules for Howard because they didn't know how a female detective would conduct herself in an all-male unit. Tom Fontana, the show's executive producer, even had to fight to keep Howard on the show as executives didn't find her interesting, but she was still written out of the show starting with the 5th season. Simon initially wanted to kill Kima off in season 1. If you don't know, Kima is shot in a sting gone wrong toward the end of the first season. Melanie Nichols King, who plays Kima's wife Cheryl on the show, told Sonia Sohn prior to even finishing work on the pilot that Kima was to be killed off during the first season. Sohn felt understandably betrayed that the executives had not been upfront about that with her, even though they'd made the decision already. However, an executive named Carolyn Strauss argued to keep her on the show, which was a great move because Kima and her wife Cheryl were probably the first time many of us saw black queer women portrayed on television. According to Simon, Sonia Sohn added all the subtlety to Kima herself. I have a soft spot for Sonia Sohn because we're actually from the same city. In fact, initially, Sohn felt conflicted about making entertainment out of what is reality for so many, and because the circumstances reminded her of home. Seth Gilliam, the actor that portrays Ellis Carver, originally auditioned for the role of Stringer Bell, and Hauk and Carver were the characters from the cop side that I feel like viewers got to know the least. I just wanted to mention that also because could you see this man portraying Stringer Bell? Absolutely not. Bubbles, who is portrayed by Royo, is another character that's based on a real person, an informant affectionately called Bubbles, who also went by the names Possum and Larry Johnson. He was a real criminal informant for the Baltimore Police Department at one time. Apparently, Bubbles was a large man and looked a lot like Lance Reddick, who they were originally considering for the part. They even said that he was runner-up for the role. Reddick actually auditioned for the roles of Bubbles and Bunk before he got the role of Lieutenant Cedric Daniels. Prior to this, Reddick had done work on The Corner and Oz, playing an addict both times. The real Bubbles started using at 15 and was addicted by age 17. He worked selling produce on the street, which is something that Bubbles does for a while in the show. The real Bubbles used to be a sneak thief, sneaking into stores through the roof and breaking out through the window, which would always puzzle the police as to how he entered and left. He allegedly had a photographic memory and watched everything, while pretty much no one watched him, so he got away with a lot without being caught. If you remember the red hat trick Bubbles would do when identifying key players in the drug game for the detectives, that's something that the real Bubbles used to do for detectives. In fact, Bubbles lived in several big cities and used the red hat trick for the first time in New York when the feds kept grabbing the wrong person. Like the character in the show, Bubbles was very smart and always 2 steps ahead even of the detectives. According to Simon, once Bubbles brought his infant son with him to the police station after he escaped a prison facility. He figured if they were going to lock him up, he'd hand his baby to the one that looked the fastest and run. We're jumping a bit ahead here, but Bubbles' interaction with the Fiend and accidental killing of his friend Sherrod in season 4 was also borrowed from the real Bubbles story. The only difference was that in real life, Bubbles killed the stick-up kid that kept robbing him and the stick-up kid's friend by replacing dope with battery acid. Bubbles died from AIDS in 1992, and after finding out about his death, David Simon wrote his obituary. Bubbles is one of the show's most popular characters due to his unwavering spirit and desire to do good. Drugs are destroying his mind and his body and his ego, but not his good spirit. Bubbles doesn't succeed in beating his addiction until season 5 of the show, but we get to see him in so many different situations that he's a fully realized person, and we have so much affection. He's funny, he's slick, he's easygoing. I don't think there's anyone that wasn't rooting for Bubbles to do well. Royo would say that he got into acting acting as a way to make his father laugh because he was always so stoic and serious. Royo had previous roles in the 2000 Shaft film and smaller roles in other movies and shows like Law & Order. Royo admitted to not wanting to pursue the role of Bubbles for some time. First, he felt that Chris Rock's performance in New Jack City and Samuel L. Jackson's performance in Jungle Fever were the epitome of portraying an addicted character, and he didn't feel that he'd have anything new to add to the portrayal. Then Royo would say, "I was a little superior to the role, thinking a junkie was different from people addicted to other things, thinking they were bad people. But Royo was broke, and his manager made it more like a challenge to get the role to keep him interested. To prepare for the role, Royo began to deliberately deprive himself of things he did every day, like turning on the TV as background noise, kissing his wife, and drinking Coca-Cola, and wrote down how he voiced his irritation. Royo would also seek out advice on his performance from addicts in Baltimore. I went out of my way to meet some of them, to try and find a common thread I could hang on. But I found there isn't one. The drug affects everyone in different ways. They're human beings, and most of them were just happy to talk to someone trying to depict them as human beings. If an addict told Royo that he did something wrong, he'd ask to shoot the scene again and implement their changes. After this, Royo found himself getting into character so much that he'd black out, saying, "All of a sudden, I just really started having blackout moments. When the director yelled cut, I didn't know what I just did. I was just in the moment. I was in the zone. Bubbles was doing what Bubbles would do. I think I really just became Bubs. Bubbles became me, so to speak." After that whole first season, I couldn't tell you what I did in the scenes. I had to rewatch it. I don't remember some of the stuff I did. I was really immersed in it. There are also several stories of Royo being mistaken for a real addict by security and addicts in the area. Once, security attempted to kick him out when they saw him at the craft services table. Similarly, Royo said that while many addicted people would come to his trailer to advise him on his performance or to praise his performance, the fact that Bubbles was a character and he would change his clothes and become a different person outside of the set seemed to hurt their feelings because they couldn't do the same. At first, Simon told Royo and Michael K. Williams that since their characters were outsiders, he didn't know how long they'd last, but before long, he considered Bubbles the heart of the show and wouldn't kill him off. When Royo learned that the real Bubbles passed away, he was just waiting for that to happen in the show, but it never did. Speaking of Michael K. Williams, I wanted to spend a little extra time talking about him. Not only is he, and by extension, Omar, one of the best parts about the show, he was literally Obama's favorite, but he was also so loved, and his death came as a surprise to so many people a few years ago. I don't think he gets the credit he deserves for the caliber of performance he was giving the girls as Omar. So we'll talk a little bit about it right now, and we'll talk more about Omar later. Williams got his start dancing in music videos for artists like Missy Elliott and Genuine. The first time he got to play a character was thanks to Tupac. This man Tupac is like the Stan Lee of black pop culture. He's everywhere. Williams felt that since he had a huge scar on his face, he would automatically be typecast. So he made it his responsibility to make redeemable characters out of the roles he was typecast into. He would say, "No one wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to become a jailbird. You don't aspire to do that. I've seen it far too many times. Good people, strong-minded men and women who are intelligent, and they took their gift and just turned to the streets because that's all they saw or that's all they felt they had."
I don't get to assimilate into anything other than the black experience. For me to be given the opportunity to be a storyteller and to tell narrative of people in my community that look like me, I wear that as a badge of honor and a huge responsibility.
Prior to The Wire, Williams was in debt, depressed, and ready to give up on his acting dreams, and then saw his episode of The Sopranos on TV and got inspired to continue looking for acting work.
When Omar Devon Little came into my life, I was in an extremely dark place. I was in debt, borrowing money from my family to pay my rent in the projects. 9/11 had come and gone, and I was lost. I remember I was sitting down in my living room with my cousin, and here comes my episode of The Sopranos. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. There's something wrong with this picture. I'm looking at myself on television, but I'm sitting here, kind of like really not being productive with this gift, with this opportunity. And I went back to my mom and I said, you know what? I think I need to give show business one more shot.
He was still in this funk when he got a fax from Alexa Fogel. Allegedly, prior to this, Fogel had been scouring the streets of New York for Williams because she thought he was so perfect for the role of Omar. Williams is always described by his contemporaries as polite, kind, and gentle. His relationships with people seem to be so intimate and fruitful as well. Here's what Debbie Young, head of the makeup department on The Wire, had to say about Williams. I remember when Michael K. Williams came to the series, his character didn't even have a name. He was Watcher Number 1. For the longest time, I'd seen him in silhouette at night in a vehicle, looking out the window. I just remember he was so nervous. A sweet, kind, beautiful personality, but he was nervous. I could tell. I just remember putting my hand on his shoulder and telling him, "You're not here by accident, you're here by divine order. So you get out there and you dance as hard as you can." I'm telling you, he went out there and the next thing I know, we had Omar coming. He was just wonderful. He had a connection to his humanity that allowed him to portray and go a lot further and deeper than most people and most characters can and do. That's exactly what made him great. He was able to transform but be truthful. Omar would be Williams' first time being able to play a character for a long period of time. This means that he was able to really develop Omar, and all of his decisions really do seem like thorough and purposeful throughout his performance. Like Barksdale, there are several different inspirations for Omar Little. For example, Ed Burns brings up a man named Ferdinand who would rob drug dealers and shoot them in the leg with a shotgun when they didn't give it up. Of course, Omar is known for his shotgun and only turning on touts and dealers. In fact, due to his shotgun and flapping trench coat, Omar was always compared to Wild West figures like Nat Love. The most well-known inspiration for Omar was Donnie Andrews, who the New York Times called a reformed stick-up man. When he was 10, Andrews saw a man get beat to death for 15 cents. When reflecting on the incident, Andrews said, "I made up my mind that I would never be a victim. I would never be the prey. I'd be the hunter." Andrews discovered that if he robbed dealers instead of stores or bars, he made 10 times as much. Many of Andrews' real experiences were implemented for Omar's character. Andrews always preferred to work alone, and he even jumped out of a 6th-story window after a failed robbery, much like Omar, who jumps out of a 4th-story window in season 4. Andrews went on to marry Fran Boyd from The Corner, acted alongside Michael K. Williams in The Wire, and passed away in 2012. If you want to know more about Andrews' life, please check out this interview in this High Snobiety article. It's great. The best thing about Omar is that he lived what this book refers to as the virtuous thug life. Omar is Robin Hood being chased equally by the government and the merry men. Omar was wanted by the police and Barksdale's people and then Marlo's people. He was easily the most notorious character on the show, but he was also the one with morals that were the most clean cut. Omar was described as a loner with a strict code of morals that need only make sense to himself. He didn't like when the kids on the block idolized him. He didn't like when taxpayers, citizens, and children got involved in the drug game at all. He also doesn't curse. This was something I didn't even realize until season 4. Even knowing how notorious he was and how mean he was with a shotgun, Omar was a loving and compassionate character. Williams would say, "I tried to make him believable by playing him from a sensitive perspective, not as an alpha male. I played him very vulnerable. When you hurt Omar's feelings, he acts a certain way." As dangerous and vengeful as he was, Omar was no stranger to loving relationships. When we see him with his lovers in the show, he's always very affectionate. There's also Butchie, who he valued and loved very much. According to Wilson, Omar was a man whom dope kingpins mocked for being in sexual/romantic relationships with other men, and yet they were not only deathly afraid of him, but helpless in the face of his constant onslaughts. Another large part of Omar's character was his homosexuality. Not only had a gay man never been portrayed this way on television before, but his sexuality made him braver and his existence itself more dangerous. For example, when Avon found out Omar was gay, he upped the bounty on Omar's head. Being gay was reason enough for people on the block to cause Omar harm. All the other things he did just added insult to injury. My favorite thing about Omar is his whistle.
Here he comes.
Yo, son, come on. Yo, Omar's coming, man.
And not just because it makes these scenes look so badass, but because Michael K. Williams could not whistle. Whenever we hear Omar whistle the farmer in the Dell, he's being dubbed by a woman named Susan Allen Back. Good job, Miss Susan, you killed that. When you compare Omar to other characters, you realize just how ambiguous the morals of all of our characters are. For example, Jimmy McNulty is way less virtuous and good than Omar, though on paper, Omar is the bad one. Omar is the one who is shot and killed while making a purchase at a corner store, while McNulty is constantly given chance after chance to right his wrongs while making a living on the taxpayer's dime. Here's a side note really quickly. I have so many thoughts about the duality between Omar and Marlo. It's not even and funny, but we'll have to wait until the second part of this series to get into that when we talk about season 4. Williams was also the one that brought Felicia Snook Pearson to the show, but we'll talk about that later on too. I'm just putting this here to let you know that we are going to talk about it, just not at this second. Like we discussed previously, David Simon and his team knew that The Wire would be a different kind of show, one that they would have to teach the audience to watch. The show didn't use narration or explicit transitions into new scenes or situations. When the scene ends, the show just cuts to the next one. The audience is meant to feel like a fly on the wall near where these real conversations are taking place. For example, though this chess scene from the season 1 episode The Buys is relevant to how the drug game and life overall works for those in the series, the show doesn't explicitly refer back to it until the season 4 episode Final Grades. Similarly, HBO executives wanted Omar's initial robbery scene cut out because it seemed random to them, but Simon told them they had to wait for it to make sense. That means that they would have to teach the audience to pay attention to what they may assume are small insignificant details, and to remember these details for entire seasons. They also didn't really use flashbacks to reacquaint a character or the audience with what took place in the past. I think there are only 2 used in the entire series. So if you watched The Wire and wondered why the writing was so good, it's because it had to be. If the writing was subpar for even a scene, the audience would miss out on much needed information, and due to the show's ethos, it wouldn't catch them up later. Similarly, The Wire very rarely uses music at all, and most of the time that music was diegetic and organically coming from the scene and not from production after the fact. Simon would say, "I hate it when somebody purposely tries to have the lyrics match the visual. It brutalizes the visual in a way to have the lyrics dead on point. Yet at the same time, it can't be totally off point. It has to glance at what you're trying to say." Just like the audience, actors were none the wiser in terms of the storylines and the fates of their characters. Simon never let them know what would happen ahead of time because he wanted them to commit to whatever was happening with their character in the moment. Similarly, they would film scenes simultaneously in separate units. The units were another reason some characters went so long without ever having scenes together. You can't watch an interview about The Wire without the cast members talking about the hospitality of the people of Baltimore and the way that the people in Baltimore neighborhoods impact characterization and filming. All locations used in the show were real. They shot on real street corners in real drug houses with syringes on the floor, etc. They had to adjust their behavior for their environment. For example, they quickly learned that when you heard a pop, you better duck. When Potts, who plays Brother Mazzone in the show, had an assistant hold an umbrella over him in the rain against his wishes, Nina Noble told him that it looked too Hollywood and he needed to hold his own damn umbrella. Fredro Starr, who played the character Marquise Bird Hilton for a short stint on the show, would say it was like living in the past. It was kind of like a third world country to me almost, just cracks on the sidewalk. Once they lost a shooting location because there was a sniper in the area. Another time it was because the police were removing a dead body. J.D. Williams, who plays Bodie in the show, was arrested for being out after Baltimore's curfew and was released at 10 a.m. and forced to walk home. According to Perennial, they were filming at a strip club called the Ritz on Eastern Avenue. During production, the owner was arrested for money laundering and the club was taken over by the FBI. For about 6 months, the FBI were their landlords, which is to say they're the ones who approved their shooting schedule as it pertained to the strip club. Not only would fans mob the actors when they came out of their trailers, but they would also bake them pies and stuff, not just because the show was being made outside of their homes, but because they'd begun to feel like the show was finally telling the stories that had become so commonplace in their neighborhoods. According to Andre Royo, the feeling of Baltimore at the time was so despaired, so we're not trying no more. It is what it is. This is where we live, and who gives a fuck? People just drive through. People on their way to DC or New York were forgotten. As we got on telling the stories, and when the show started airing, you start feeling different. People start feeling like they're talking about Baltimore. We matter. This is our show. Each season of The Wire has a different rendition of the same theme song, Way Down in the Hole by Tom Waits. According to a producer named Karen Thorson, Simon wanted the voice of the vocals to reflect the main theme of the content of the season. I just read that quote to y'all about how he doesn't like the lyrics to match, so he wants the voice to match. Get it straight, those are different. The most prominent example of this is the version of the theme song used for season 4, which focuses on 4 children, Michael, Namond, Duquan, and Randy. Every time I refer to them as a whole, I'll be calling them the Boys of Summer, if you don't mind. The theme song for the 4th season was recorded by a group of boys that called themselves Domage. The group was made up of Ivan Ashford, Markel Steele, Cameron Brown, Tariq Al-Sabir, and Avery Burgess. It looks like the name is pronounced Domage, but This is actually a French word, dommage, which means damage. It's also a word in Haitian Creole, which is similar to broken French. Due to the fact that there's not a lot of information about these boys online, and I don't want to pry because they were children, and since they don't have an outward presence, they probably wanted to retain their privacy. I'm not sure if they had Haitian roots or anything like that, but that's what the name means if you're curious. There's a reason that this chess scene is what many people think of when they think of The Wire. Not only does it explain the values on which each institution in the show stands, but it does so in a completely digestible way. Each institution, whether it's the drug market, politics, land development, or something else entirely, is a game made up of its own internal norms, roles, and quantified measures of success and failure. Winning is always the goal of the game, and it's often cyclical in nature, as this is how the game retains players. In Season 4, Episode 13, Final Grades, Bodie recalls Dangelo's chess explanation and its inherent inequality, ending his monologue with,
"We like them little bitches on the chessboard."
Bodie remained unwaveringly loyal to the Barksdale organization, and then to Slim Charles, and then to Marlo. He did everything the game said he should have done. He didn't snitch, he didn't steal, he did what he was told, and he was still killed on his own corner. According to writer Ty Fagan, a pawn can't assume that following the rules makes him any less expendable. Fagan also said it's easier to play along than to follow one's own conscience. Deviating from the rules of the game is a death sentence for some, but obeying the rules does not automatically guarantee safety. Playing the game by the rules is no guarantee of security, and deviating from them invites harsh punishment. Simply opting out is impossible, and victory requires trading out any semblance of a moral conscience. According to The Wire, Truth Be Told, the official companion to the show, TV crime drama has its origins in the Western. The traditional Western rests on a belief in a world that is in essence innocent, albeit eternally menaced by evil. The Wire, by contrast, assumes a fallen world. There is no specific threat. Corruption is the state of things. Or rather, innocence, not evil, is the threat to the status quo. Because when you set off a chain of events in innocence, a nice word for ignorance, you have no way of knowing or even suspecting how much damage you might cause. The companion goes on to state that if you deny an entire segment of society access to the big game, they will create a shadow game, mirroring the establishment in every way but societal legitimacy. Though winning is the point of the game, there are rare instances where players can determine what winning means to them. A great example of this is Omar. A man's got to have a code. Stealing from stash houses and touts is what a win looks like for Omar. But Omar was only able to pursue a different victory by being smarter and more observant than his enemies. According to Omar, winning the game is not an end that justifies any means. However, his foil, Marlo, is the exact opposite. In the episode Refugees, a security guard for a small corner store watches Marlo steal lollipops while paying for another purchase. Then he completely ignores the guard. Later on, he asks Chris and Snoop to take care of the guard because he talked back. Clearly, Marlo's definition of winning the game is all about reputation. It's about status. It's about control. Also, the price of the pack's going up. While some may feel like reducing open-air drug markets and politics down to games is an oversimplification, there's a lot of meaning in the metaphor itself. Fagan says its depiction of the world as a game is a way of objecting to that world, of demanding something more. Throughout the show, several characters seek out their own form of justice in a way that the game deems acceptable, but this proves itself futile, as all getting justice does is create the same desire for justice in others, leading to a cycle of murder and revenge. Before we get into the meat of Season 1 of The Wire, let's talk about the Orange Couch. The Orange Couch became sort of a hangout spot for Bodie, Wallace, Poot, and Dangelo in Season 1. According to Vincent Peronio, a costume designer, we were talking through the low rise in that neighborhood, and there by a dumpster was that orange couch. A month later, when we started working on the film, we put it in the middle of the court, and it surprisingly became a part of the script. It was the hangout. After they wrapped filming the pilot, they dumped the couch because they weren't sure that the show would actually be picked up. When they were picked up, they didn't have the couch anymore and would spend around $3,000 rebuilding it from scratch, which included ordering an expensive fabric from England and then ripping it up so that the couch looked worn. Due to a change in setting since the projects had torn down at the top of the second season, the couch was only necessary for the first season. A few weeks before filming for Season 3, the couch was sold on eBay and the money went to the Ella Thompson Fund. The fund created in the name of the neighborhood hero from the corner, and the fund is still in good standing today. As I said previously, the first season is pretty straightforward, so there's not much to dwell on. The Wire premiered on June 2nd, 2002 with the death of a tout named Snot Boogie. Snot Boogie always wanted to play dice with guys on the block, but he never had any money. They still always let him play because
Got to. This America, man.
Right away, the show establishes two different versions of America. There's the land of opportunity, and then there's the version that the characters live in. One devoid of legitimate opportunities where any possibilities of advancement are merely an illusion. According to Connecting the Wire, all roads lead back to West Baltimore, wherever its denizens wander. It is home, a place that is inescapable. This scene also characterizes McNulty and the rest of the BPD. There's a dead body in front of McNulty, but all he can think about is how dumb Snot Boogie's name is. Jumping to the end of the season, Wallace's death is likely the most impactful part. Not only does it further ignite BPD's investigation into the Barksdale organization, since Wallace technically flipped on the Barksdales, and not only is it committed by two of Wallace's very close friends and ordered by someone Wallace looked up to, but it's the main reason that Dangelo isolates himself from the Barksdales and even his own infant son in season 2. Wallace is constantly called a child, even though he's essentially the same age as Bodie and Poot. Wallace plays with toys, but really, they're all children. When Bodie and Poot put a gun to Wallace, he was as disbelieving of the betrayal as he was afraid. In this scene, we also see a difference forged between Poot and Bodie. Bodie comes off rather unsympathetic to the entire situation, while it's clear that Poot questions what they're doing. I let this part of the recording sit for a little while, but I have to come back and clarify my thoughts on this because, first of all, Bodie is one of my favorite characters from the show. Of course, he is the picture of a pawn. If you look up pawn in the dictionary, you'll see Bodie, but that's not really his fault. More than anything, Bodie was exceptionally true to himself, and I'll talk a little bit more about Bodie later on, but I think a more accurate description of what I was trying to say is that Bodie is much better at repressing his emotions about the entire Wallace ordeal than Poot. It's very clear that Bodie is not happy with what they're doing and that he doesn't want to kill Wallace. He wanted Wallace to stay out of town so that Wallace could keep himself safe because he knew that if Wallace came back that it was over for him. So I think I was doing Bodie a bit of a disservice by saying that he was sort of like unfeeling about things. He definitely felt something. It just wasn't as clear as what Poot was feeling, but I think that's by design. It's because of the kind of person that Bodie is, because this is kind of what he was bred for. I don't think I mentioned it later, but when Cuddy gets out of jail, he talks very briefly with Bodie about Bodie's older brother. His brother's name was James, and he just said, oh, James been dead. And there's no emotion there. So you know that Bodie is an emotionally repressed person just because of all the things that he's had to deal with. And as I discussed before, this is not an environment where you can dwell on your grief and you can be sad because you have to hit your next lick. You have to get your money the next way. You have to man your corner or get it stolen. You have to do what is asked of you or lose your life. Emotional repression, or cool pose as it's called academically, is really beneficial to Bodie in this environment, and that's why he didn't emote as much during this scene. Along with the people in the show, Simon characterizes the world in which our characters live. The drug market is just a feature of the low-rise projects. For the most part, we see that life just continues on for many there. People get high and shot and they overdose and life goes on. Similarly, Stringer's macroeconomics classes juxtapose Hauk and Carver studying for the sergeant's test. While Stringer will make an effort at getting out of the drug game, we can infer that what he's learning in class is being applied to the drug game. We actually see this when he implements Robert's rules of order in subsequent episodes. It establishes that heroin and coke are just products in a capitalistic market. There is a demand, so there will be a supply. It's similar to Omar saying,
I got the shotgun. You got the briefcase. It's on the game though, right?
we can fairly say that everyone involved in the show this season is just doing their job. At the advice of his wife, writer Laura Lippman, Simon read a book by George Pelecanos, a fiction writer, and at the funeral of a mutual friend, he asked Pelecanos to work on The Wire with him. Pelecanos agreed since he'd never been able to get his books turned into films, and he wrote the penultimate episode of Season 1, mostly for the death of Wallace, and then came on full-time for Season 2. While Season 1 was an incredibly straightforward and almost typical police procedural that hadn't caught the attention of anyone special in particular, The Wire was still greenlit for Season 2, which, in the opinion of many of its fans, was one of its worst.